Today, I decided to record a couple of quick presentations on the subject of emotional self regulation. In particular, what it does, what it doesn't do, and to make sure people understand that although it's a really important skill to develop, that it's not the only thing that we can do if we want to live calmer and more emotionally centered lives. When Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence was first published in the 90s, this is when most of us learned the phrase emotional self regulation. These are basically the strategies that we use to keep our overactive emotional response from basically ruining our relationships with other people. And since that time, since that publication, we've learned so much more about how our brains work, about the neurobiology behind childhood attachment, and how patterns that we learn as kids can follow us into adulthood. And so, because we've learned so much, now people from all walks of life are using the word regulate. I mean, we hear it all the time, right? It's pretty much the buzzword that we use now to describe managing our emotions in any setting, whether it's at the office or at home. And although I can say that learning to regulate or manage my own emotions has been very helpful, especially in the moment, like when it's happening, I initially thought that it was pretty much the most I could do. In other words, I didn't know when I was first learning about self regulation that managing my emotional state was only one option and one step in a larger, more sustainable process. I mean, no one really explained that to me. So that's what I want to cover here today. So before we dive in, let's do a quick review of what the term regulate even means. Regulation, by its simplest definition, is the act of controlling, managing, or maintaining the rate or amount of something so it operates more smoothly. As example, we might use medication to manage or regulate blood pressure that's too high. Regulating high blood pressure means our heart circulation runs more smoothly. A parent might manage or regulate an excessive amount of television that a young child might watch so that they get their schoolwork done. Regulating the amount of TV means that the child's performance in school might be better. In the personal development world, regulation is used to describe the way we manage or cope with an emotional nervous system response that activates too intensely, for too long, or too frequently, so that our interactions can be more productive and loving. So, that state that's operating too intensely and at inappropriate times, it's not stuck that way. Just like learning to lower high blood pressure so we don't have to manage it with medication anymore, we can change how our emotions activate so we don't have to manage it with self regulation strategies as often. Realize that when we're born, our brains and emotional nervous system are not fully developed when we first come out of the womb. I mean, they work like in a basic infantile manner, but just like our brain, our emotional response is designed to sort of be curated, refined, and developed to sort of reflect the world that we're currently living in. Now, if you're someone who experienced a traumatic upbringing, or like me, grew up in a household decades before parents understood how important this stuff was or how even to do it, and if your emotional nervous system, for a variety of reasons, never learned how or didn't finish learning how to turn on and off in the appropriate amounts, intensities, and at the right time, well, now as adults, it can fire up in some pretty raw and unrefined ways, and at some pretty inappropriate times, right? And given that our pace of technical advancement keeps increasing, it's no wonder that our stress levels are increasing too. I mean, that's a topic that we'll cover another time, but in all systems, there's sort of a sweet spot ratio between the rate of expansion of anything and the strength of its supporting foundation that keeps things from imploding. So if our emotional stability isn't reliable enough, I can see the rate of our intellectual advancements sort of overpowering our emotional ability to handle it. So, to me, that's another reason why emotional development is so important. Our baseline state either needs to finish what wasn't finished earlier in our life, or since we're now adults and our lives have changed, and I don't see the pace of the world slowing down anytime soon, part of the work of learning to thrive in that world is learning to slow down in some areas, yes, but it's also about aligning or updating our emotional stability to reflect the demands of the world that we live in now so it can support the life and relationships that we really want going forward. I mean, no one's stopping you from living with and coping with stress using the nervous system state that we were handed growing up. But I personally didn't find it very effective long term or that it worked consistently across different situations. And I found that it just didn't support the life that I wanted to live now as an adult. So now, as adults, we basically have a couple of options. We can regulate and manage our current emotional state, sort of as it is, through learned coping skills like flexible thinking and deep breathing, learning to pause and movement. And we can also finish developing or training the emotional response itself. So, when I hear or read people using the term self regulation to describe how they're coping with or managing the current state of their emotional response system, I also wonder if they know that if they wanted to, they could also change the baseline emotional response itself. Before I go on, let me clarify the difference between emotional management or regulation and emotional development. One is a tool or a strategy, the other is a process, and each one has a different goal. Emotional regulation describes the coping strategy or the management practice that temporarily controls an overactive or underactive response in the moment. But it doesn't change the underlying default response itself. Said differently, regulation controls the response, but it doesn't change the response. Now, on the other hand, emotional development does change the underlying activation response. It's actually the continuation of the emotional refinement, moderation, and differentiation process that wasn't completed earlier in our life. And that process results in a new default state where emotional management or regulation just isn't needed as often. In other words, as a summary, we can both manage the emotional state that we have and develop the system so it doesn't need as much management anymore. Now, at this point, some of you may be saying, like, wait, what? I know it sounds a little bit like a riddle, right? So, if it helps, I use this analogy to describe the difference. Imagine an employee at a fast growing company who's technically savvy, but never learned solid social or relational skills. And so, as their boss, you're frequently intervening to smooth out difficult interactions with other employees. Well, you have a couple of choices, assuming you can't fire them. You can either continue to manage or regulate that employee as they are and keep jumping in there to smooth over arguments or upsets, or you can also help develop that employee so they eventually don't need as much management or intervention. See what I'm getting at? Part of the reason that I'm making this recording is that I sense that the growing focus on this shorter term strategy has resulted in people sort of forgetting that it may not always be a long term solution. Emotional self regulation is a strategy that's effective, but it's part of a longer term development process. And I'm not sure how many people know or understand that. Or maybe they just don't care. Or maybe they just don't know why it might be important to care. So, the reason it's important to care, or the main reason it matters that we understand the difference between managing our emotions and developing our emotions, is so that anyone watching this knows that there is more you can do if the managing your emotional state as is type strategy stops working, or it stops working consistently across different scenarios. And please understand that it's only been in the last few decades that we've come to understand that this is actually possible, like to change the emotional response that we have. I mean, we used to believe that our brain and emotional nervous system was pretty much set in stone after the age of 25. And that was the best we could do, was just manage it the way it was going forward. Well, now we know differently. Although we may not be able to directly influence that primitive sort of instinctual fight or flight response, like when it first starts, and we probably wouldn't want to, right? It still saves us from real life threat. Even though we can't maybe stop that first individual response, we can influence how intensely it activates, when it activates, and for how long it activates with specific, consistent long-term practices that recondition its associations. Granted, if we don't keep learning and keeping our brains generating new pathways over the years, it can get more difficult every decade of our life. I mean, I can vouch for that. But it is possible to make changes to our brain and emotional nervous system all throughout our adult life. Now, in the next video, I'm going to cover when emotional management and self-regulation are great tools to have, as well as how we can tell when it may be time to consider doing the deeper but longer lasting emotional development work. See you in the next video.